Well, some butterfly. Pretty major cascading failure. Our electricity grid is unfortunately subject to that sort of thing because it rather resembles the system of driving nationally on two-lane state roads that existed before we had the interstate highway system that Eisenhower began in the 1950s. The electricity grid today is somewhat like what we would be facing if we had only two-lane interstate highways and they were all jammed with 20-ton containers trying to provide just-in-time delivery of everything under the sun all over the country. The grid is not close to being as secure as it should be, as resilient as it should be, as smart as it should be. And so one set of issues we have to deal with in these days and times is the threat of cascading failure from disturbances. And one type of disturbance that we interject into the system is that the fuels we use to produce electricity produce enough carbon dioxide that we are creating a risk of adding to climate change. One does not have to believe that all climate change is caused by human beings. I don't believe that. I don't think most people do. But we are augmenting the problem by putting a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. It's a little bit as if one were unlucky enough, say, to have a family history of lung cancer, and so one wants to be especially careful, and then to say, well, you know, it's fine, since I might get lung cancer anyway, I'll smoke 5 packs a day. We as a society are doing the equivalent of smoking 5 packs a day in the ecosphere by adding so much carbon dioxide to it, and we need to do some things about that. We need to do vigorous research and development on finding ways to sequester the CO2 from coal-fired power plants. We need, I think, to move out to some extent with nuclear power. We need to work very hard on energy efficiency and on the renewables, particularly solar and wind. And we need to do all of this and get busy. And we need to make the grid a lot more resilient. Now, that's sort of the malignant problems of electricity generation. We have malevolent problems, too, because terrorists are unfortunately a good deal smarter than tree branches. They can read the web as easily as you and I, and they can find out the vulnerabilities of our electricity grid. Some of those are vulnerabilities to hacking and to cyber attacks. Some of them are vulnerabilities of parts of the system that are not well protected. But we need to get busy on this issue, and we need to do so promptly. The electricity grid, however, is at least here. And if we have problems with it, if we haven't modernized it enough, if it's not resilient enough, if it's not secure enough, if we need to capture and sequester the CO2 from burning coal, we can do these things because we are here where the problem is and we can work on it. Most of this, some of it requires some technological innovation, but most of this is not technologically all that difficult or all that expensive. It's a problem of organization. We really kind of have 50 electricity grids in the country, and there's very little authority even to deal with the security of the grid at a central level. But the grid is at least here, and if we could get ourselves organized, we could make some very substantial improvements, both in the solving the malignant problems and the malevolent problems, such as terrorism. Oil, however, is not here, at least not sufficiently for us to be able to deal with our oil problem for transportation here entirely in the United States. Now, we can make a dent in it by doing things like drilling in the outer continental shelf, but what that does is it reduces to some extent the flow of borrowing of funds going overseas for imported oil, helps with the balance of payments, can help with American jobs. We borrow, depending on whether oil is $70 or $140 a barrel from between last summer and now, we borrow something between $350 and $700 billion a year just to import oil. A huge sum. Every billion of that that we can deal with domestically, whether it's by drilling on the Outer Continental Shelf or producing alternative biofuels or by efficiency improvements in cars, is about 10,000 American jobs. So it's worth doing. But oil presents a unique range of both malignant and malevolent problems that is going to require us to do more than that. Oil infrastructure is somewhat vulnerable to unintentional natural interference of the sort Hurricane Katrina nearly took out the Colonial Pipeline, the major pipeline to the northeastern United States from the Gulf. But quick action by some people who work on pipeline security kept that from happening. We were lucky on that one. But oil's malevolent problems are far more intractable and far more difficult to deal with because much of that infrastructure that can be interfered with is abroad. For example, in February 2.5 years ago, Al-Qaeda attacked Abqaiq, which is the largest oil production facility in the world in northeastern Saudi Arabia. Had they succeeded, particularly in taking out the sulfur clearing towers, they could have taken 5 or 6 million barrels a day of oil offline for many, many months, certainly sent oil well up above $200 a barrel. Happily, they rigged their truck bomb wrong. They tried again about a year later, were thwarted probably by some useful cooperation between American and Saudi intelligence. But they haven't given up trying, and their fatwas talk about going after the oil infrastructure all the time. And then we have the problem of the spread of terrorist and extremist ideology in the Middle East. One problem here is that the religion that governs in Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi Islam, is not the open, benevolent form of Islam that one finds in Indonesia or in many parts of Central Asia among the Sufis and the like. If you read the fatwas of the Saudi imams, the Wahhabis, to one another in Arabic or in translation, it's quite clear. Their views are somewhere between murderous and genocidal with respect to Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates, and massively repressive of everyone else, including particularly women. The objective is a worldwide caliphate, a religious dictatorship, and the ideology is essentially the same as Al-Qaeda's. Al-Qaeda and the Wahhabis don't disagree about substance. They don't disagree about where they should be taking the world. They disagree about who should be in charge. They disagree about whether one should feel free to fly airplanes into buildings whenever one wants, or whether or not one serves at the behest and service of the Saudi state. So there is a bit of a problem when the world is shipping hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year to these governments, not just Saudi Arabia, but other oil exporters such as Russia and Venezuela and others. Thomas Friedman, in his fine new book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, has a chapter about what this problem of enriching some of our foreign governments. He calls his chapter "Fill Her Up with Dictators," which is a reasonably accurate characterization of the fact that 8 of the 9 world's largest exporters of oil are either autocratic kingdoms or dictatorships. Only nice Norway is in sort of rough company there. So those hundreds of billions mean the following. One added fact, I should interject. I think the best book about 9/11 is the Looming Tower. And in the Looming Tower, the author says that with a little over 1% of the world's Muslims, Saudi Arabia controls about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions.